overall, and this is the panel on Cynicism and Irony in Literature. We have 3 wonderful presenters and 3 wonderful presentations, and it's my pleasure to introduce the first one. One quick word, just as similar as the panel before, what we're going to have is the 3 presentations and then hopefully around 30 minutes for questions and answers. So put down all the questions you have and feel free to ask as many questions as you want afterwards. So our first presentation, as you can already see by the slide up here, our first presenter is Kaitlin Yeomans. Kaitlin is a second-year master's student in the German and Scandinavian department at the U of O. Her research interests are disability studies, contemporary literature, and the role of autofiction in representations of disability in contemporary novels. Her talk today is titled Existential Kynicism and Phenomenological Cynicism of Disability in Contemporary German Literature. Please welcome Kaitlin.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, like Joscha said, my name is Kaitlin Yeomans. I actually did revise the title of my talk because I wanted to talk more about Kynicism and Cynicism of Disability and kind of avoid the traditional or the tradition behind existentialism and phenomenology. So I wanted to focus in on the cynicism and kynicism that I'm talking about. Quick introduction. Oh, here's my alternate title. It would be Wilhelm Genezino, my alternate title actually, Wilhelm Genezino's Gerhard Wahrlich as the modern Cynic. So to start off, I just want to clarify that the novel I'm analyzing or talking about, it's more of a character analysis, is Das Glück in glücksfernen Zeiten, or Happiness in Times Far from Happiness, which is written by Wilhelm Genezino, German author, published in 2009. And to give a brief summary of the novel itself, this novel follows the story of Gerhard Wahrlich, who has a PhD in philosophy. He wrote his dissertation about Heidegger, and the only job he can find is in a laundromat. What I think is important to note is that Sloterdijk does distinguish between the modern cynic and the ancient cynic. Let me skip that for now. So for cynicism, to describe it, I have this Calvin and Hobbes comic. Life could be worse, Calvin. Life could be a lot better, too. And I think this really highlights modern cynicism's dissatisfaction and the understanding that things, while they may not be bad, could always be better. In essence, there's always this striving for some sort of ideal. And this is illustrated also by this quote from George Carlin. Inside every cynical person, there is a disappointed idealist. So not only is the cynic dissatisfied with life, the cynic is dissatisfied with life because the cynic knows that ideals can never be reached. Sloterdijk describes this as enlightened false consciousness, which I take to mean that Sloterdijk is pointing to the fact that we understand that we have all these ideals set forth by the Enlightenment about rationality and about how things should be, but we know we can never achieve them. In contrast, Sloterdijk takes the figure of Diogenes as the ancient cynic, when we talked a little bit about Diogenes earlier. Here is a different picture of Diogenes. So Diogenes was the ancient cynic, and he was the person who told Alexander the Great to step out of his sunlight when Alexander the Great asked him if he had any wishes. So Diogenes essentially said, in that moment, essentially said, you don't have anything I want. So cynic actually comes from the ancient Greek kynikos, which is dog or dog-like, and this was an epithet which was used against the ancient cynics to sort of name them animalistic, telling them that they do things like animals, they live on dregs and outside of society and do things that society doesn't consider acceptable. Diogenes took this as a compliment because the dog, he says, knows the friend from the foe. And that also, I think, ties into disability in this novel. So, talking about disability in this novel, I'm talking about depression, and I understand that my understanding of disability comes from socially and culturally informed models that view disability not just as physically disabling conditions, but any condition that disables the body in a certain society. So a cynical approach to disability is essentially demonstrated at the beginning of this novel, and then Gerhard undergoes this sort of transformation into a kynical understanding of disability, which should be here. Here's the upshot. In Wilhelm Genesinos das Glück in Glücksfernen Zeiten, the main character, Gerhard, goes from a cynical understanding of disability to a kynical understanding of disability. And so I'm going to illustrate that with quotes. I'll leave it on that slide because I just have the quotes in here. So if the cynic views disability as a moral failure, which I would argue that the cynic does, the kynic understands that disability is a fact of natural life, and the failure actually lies in these ideals set by culture to not be disabled and to not engage with disability. Of course, that's way too simplistic, and we can see this with Gerhard, because even though I define him as a cynic, he does engage in cynical behaviors and still exists within society. So I would say that it's not necessarily possible to understand cynic and cynic as a dichotomous relationship, but I do see that Gerhard moves more from cynicism toward more of a cynical approach to disability in this novel. So I've already given you a short summary of the novel. I'm going to read a quote from page 86. I'm going to read it in German first and then translate it into English. Ich rede nicht über meine vermutete Erkrankung, auch nicht mit Trauer. Es macht keinen Sinn, über Krankheiten zu sprechen. Man ist mit ihnen allein und bleibt mit ihnen allein. I didn't talk about my supposed sickness, not even with Trauer. It doesn't make sense to talk about sickness. One is alone with them and stays alone with them. So in what ways does this quote demonstrate a cynical approach to disability? Firstly, Gerhard emphasizes here with the cynical shame about illness. Because illness to the cynic represents personal shortcomings, the cynic copes by silencing the discourse of their own body, by not talking about sickness. Gerhard even refuses to discuss his troubles with Traudl, which shows just how stigmatized disability is under a cynical model. I also want to take this moment to say that cynicism does offer some understanding of disability as an individual phenomenon, as cynicism views itself as highly individual. But cynicism also juxtaposes disability and the body, which is somewhat ironic because there can be no juxtaposition of the body and the body. So the cynical structure in this text illustrates that there are no dialogue about things that illustrate a failure under cynical models. Cynics don't talk about things that are outside of the societal norms that are perceived as inadequacies. This sort of internalization only serves to perpetuate cynicism as it pertains to these certain cultural standards or norms. And then what I see as unique about Das Glück in Glücksfernen Zeiten is that despite this contemporary cynicism, Gerhard actually undergoes a transcendental moment and functions as not an ancient cynic, but a modern cynic. I'd say that this moment of transcendence occurs when Gerhard is at a restaurant with his friend Annetta, and he breaks down crying after he pushes a piece of bread into her hand. So he's overcome with emotion. I just have a short quote from here. Ein krampfartiges Schluchzen überwältigt mich wellenartig. A spasmodic wail overcame me like waves. And this scene concludes with Traudl driving Gerhard to a psychiatric clinic. So in this scene, we see that Gerhard breaks the cynical mode of internalization. He, in this moment, no longer conforms to what cynicism has dubbed appropriate social behavior. Instead, his true emotions emerge from behind a cynical facade. And his crying fit is, I think, demonstrative of how cynical cultural modes undermine and repress discourse about disabilities. He is making a scene in the middle of the restaurant, and that is viewed as something that one just does not do because of these cultural norms, which are very cynical. So he essentially, in this moment, by breaking all the cultural norms, exists outside of the constraints placed upon him by a cynical society. So I would say that this moment illustrates a kynical scene within a larger cynical structure, which is what I argue that the modern Cynic is. Unlike Diogenes of Sinope, Gerhard does not renunciate society entirely. Instead, like I said, Traudl drives him to a psychiatric clinic where he begins therapy and treatment for his depression. This experience at the clinic is in many ways enlightening for Gerhard. He becomes free to talk about things he cannot talk about or is not supposed to talk about in society. It provides him a space where he is no longer cynically isolated with his depression. So I would say the birth of the clinic might actually be the birth of the Cynic. Okay, thank you for laughing at that. So Gerhard receives for his depression therapy and medication at this clinic. And this could support the idea that this novel has a wholly cynical trajectory, that the goal of getting treatment for depression is essentially to reach a cynical norm. But I would actually have to insist that that itself is sort of a cynical perception that has a penchant for alienating and denaturalizing disability. I would argue that his treatment is actually much more the result of a cynical understanding of depression and the cynical impulse to meet the needs of the body, just like Diogenes says, "Get out of my sunlight." The last quote I want to analyze in this novel is the last line. "Offenbar kann ich trotz allem immer noch wählen, wie ich in Zukunft leben möchte." Obviously, in spite of everything, I can still choose how I want to live in the future. So I think that this quote, and reading the entire novel, you can see this sort of trajectory from cynical to cynical. Not that cynical is necessarily optimistic, although this quote is. Gerhard's transformation from the modern cynic to the modern cynic. When Gerhard is operating under cynical models, he is unable to express his feelings and his own depression because of the stringent confines of cynicism. One doesn't talk about sickness. So every cynic knows this, but every cynic also knows that there are things that you experience that you cannot talk about. Yet Gerhard is also forced by this cynicism into a moment where he relinquishes control, and in that moment relinquishes all of cynicism's impositions. He satisfies the cynical impulse by meeting the needs of his body with therapy and medication, and he realizes that the cynical structures imposed on him do not have to determine his life. So in this way, I would say that we've gone from ancient cynic to modern cynic to modern cynic. First, there's the pressure of cynical systems, then there's the movement of the cynical satisfaction of one's own needs. The interesting part about Gerhard is that he still lives within society, or at least I assume he does, the novel ends after that, still lives in society in a largely cynical superstructure, but I would argue that there are always these cynical mini-structures within society designed to meet the needs of humans. And I would argue that that's not at all cynical, that is in fact purely cynical. So I would say that das Glück in glücksfernen Zeiten, happiness in times of unhappiness, or far from happiness, demonstrates the cynical cultural interpretation of disability and then outlines how this cynical interpretation of disability is something that is brought upon by cultural norms and can also be broken when one decides to no longer engage with these cultural norms. That's all I got.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Kaitlin. Our next and second talk of this panel, our next and second presenter is Reed Johnson. Reed Johnson graduated from Hamilton College with a bachelor's degree in anthropology and German studies in 2019. He has studied abroad at the University of Tübingen and the WWOFED for a summer, something like that, splitting time between Goldjoyer and plots of land around Kloster Allerheiligen, tending to cattle. At Hamilton, he worked as a German TA and more recently has aided the Hamilton College Special Collections in translation work. He particularly enjoys novels by Thomas Bernhard and Friedrich Dürrenmatt and films by Rainer Werner Fassbinder. Reed is going to talk about today about Walser's laughter, affirmation as resistance in Jakob von Guten. So please all welcome Reed.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I don't have a visual component for my presentation other than myself, I suppose. Apologies for those that enjoy that side of it. Yes. Yeah, thank you, Joscha. Yeah, I will be presenting on Robert Walser's Jakob von Guten. For brevity's sake, I'll be using primarily translations of the novel and leaving in the German in some special situations, just to emphasize it. Yeah, so I'll begin. Robert Walser represents a turn in the German literary tradition coinciding with the turn of the 20th century. His literary pursuits were ultimately a secondary form of employment, perhaps owing to an education abruptly concluded at 14. While writing on the side for various newspapers and publications, Walser maintained a series of short-term positions as an office clerk and assistant, among other jobs. Walser's characters are archetypes of this biography, servile figures who themselves balance an occupation within a bureaucratic regime with their own self-reflections upon these predicaments. Walser's biography, when read through his novels, is this interweaving of labor and writing, which Walser metaphorizes in his handwerkliches Schreiben, sort of this manual handicraft form of writing, contrasting bourgeois conceptions of literature. Walser's modernist writing is reflective of himself as a modernist figure, whose desire for self-sufficiency opposes institutionalized personage. What is naturally a process of succumbing or adhering to institutional structures is defied by the Walserian figure. As a menial task, Walser's writing diverts from the tradition of the Bildungsroman, this novel of education, as well as the bilden, sort of formative tendencies of the institution by presenting characters in a constant state of stagnant activity, much like menial labor. What Jörg Kaienbach notes is illustrating how this Mannigfaltigkeit, sort of manifoldness in the temporal present, and monotony, also remaining in the present, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In this presentation, I argue that Walser's style, this incessant beginning, represents a mode of resistance both to institutional structure and traditions of the novel. This argument will play on my reading of Walser's 1909 novel Jakob von Guten, which follows the title character's experience in the Institut Benjamin, an educational institute for young boys seeking employment as servants that closely follows an earlier schooling experience of Walser. Jakob's lack of resistance to institutional discipline in turn spells the demise of the institute. In understanding the source of this resistance, I will draw comparisons between Jakob and Bartleby the Scrivener, whereas Bartleby's resistance comes in a negativity towards menial labor, defined by a statement, "I prefer not to." Jakob's affirmative willingness to be institutionalized would be defined around his laughter. The two is a statement of nothingness. This laughter can in one sense be a cynical laughter directed at institutional practice, engaged in by both Jakob and Walser himself. I will argue this laughter is more akin to a despair. It presents itself, but it defies any satisfying interpretation. Presenting my argument for Jakob, I will first place him in relation to a fellow schoolmate, Kraus, and then secondarily to the school's administration. Jakob von Guten, the novel, parallels the life of the institution within it, the Institut Benjamin. It begins with Jakob's matriculation into the institution, and it concludes with its edifice's crumbling. Yet these beginning and concluding institutional states do not contrast each other so significantly. Jakob instead enters a decaying institution, saying, "One learns here very little, there's a shortage of teachers." Only two authority figures play any role within the institute, the brother and sister pair of Herr and Fräulein Benjamin. What we find instead is this latent institutional structure that pervades Jakob's narration. Jakob continues by saying, "None of us boys in the institute will come to anything." That is to say, we'll all be very small and subordinate later in life. The institution's aim of subjugation, rewritten here as Jakob's anticipation of a future deficiency, is instilled as this virtue of wenig, aber gründlich, so this little yet thorough. This is an internalization of institutional virtues, is the educational dynamic. Boys' only course consists of memorizing and reproducing a host of unnamed Vorschriften, these rules. Beyond this single structure element of their education, These Vorschriften appear as the boy's conscience, guiding them in the negative to self-regulate any transgressive behavior. Appropriately, this sole class, taught by Fräulein Benjamin, is entitled Wie hat sich der Knabe zu benehmen, or How should the boy behave himself? The classical idea of Bildung, the sort of individual growth and dialectical relation to the environment, is replaced by a system of internalization. Without any external structure, the boys themselves produce the institutional apparatus. For Arnold Gehlen, in his essay Menschen Institutionen, this replacement of personal with institutional aims is fundamental to an understanding of the institution itself. The instinctually deficient individual requires the structure of the institution to provide basic human needs. Living within the stabilizing institutional domain, individuals are knitted into collective groups by conducting in a socially or an institutionally ordained manner. The institution thus succeeds as a collectivizing system, one that does not impress itself upon subjects but exists through them. Jakob, however, is not cast in the mold of the institutional figure. As a first-person narrator, Jakob introduces the institute into his story. That is, his first movement is from the outside, so to speak, into the institution and its production of meaning. Entering the door of the institute, Jakob is met by a schoolboy named Kraus, who bows dumbly and promptly leads Jakob into the office of Herr Benjaminta, the head of the institute. Benjaminta, however, ignores Jakob and continues reading his newspaper. These contrasting institutional qualities and neglect from the instructor and the indiscriminate deference of the servant awakens Jakob's distrust of the institution's legitimacy. It's a feeling immediately stifled by Herr Benjaminta's sudden demand for Jakob to introduce himself. Giving his name and origin, Jakob understands himself to now be inextricably linked with the institute. He says, "Now I understand myself to be lost, for suddenly I felt I would never get away from this place." In this lost state, Jakob is bound by the institute, yet he maintains this super-institutional, sort of super-logical consciousness. Further demanded by Herr Benjamin to give up money for his tuition, Jakob's abidance is a sort of unconsciousness. He sort of immediately relinquishes the fees to the man that he now holds to be a robber and a con artist. Yet Jakob continues by stating these first impressions were things of the past, attributing their falsehood to Misstrauen and Unkenntnis, sort of mistrust and ignorance. Far from providing with the groundwork for sense-making, Jakob must understand the institution to participate within it. With understanding comes a newfound appreciation for figures like Kraus, whose obedience now appears as a sort of adornment. The twin certainties of Kraus's utmost devotion and future of being neglected and underappreciated presents itself as a sort of enigma for Jakob's super-institutional gaze, all the more enigmatic in that no one will bother to solve it. This puzzlement can be understood as the question of the logic of the institution's values detached from the institutional context. Within the context of Institut Benjaminta, Kraus is this idea of an abgerundete Null, a rounded down zero, whose place of non-worth promises secureness and completeness. Yet Kraus's zero identity appears to Jakob as a natural characteristic. In subjecting himself to a lifetime of suppression, Kraus is a sort of divine creature for Jakob, this wonderful, systematic, an den Schöpfer mahnend, so a sort of reminding of the creator. As Gehlen notes, the abolishment of the institution saps his values of logical weight, returning them to the domain of purely affective, instinctual instances. Jakob represents an institutional abolishment of an internal abolishment of the institution within the institutional context. Rather than accepting the institute's values a priori, Jakob views them against this illogical outside. The enigmatic quality is thus located at the threshold of the two, presents institutional value with a sensorial, affective weight within Jakob. Jakob's aims become tightly aligned around this discovery, not just become the abgerundete Null, but this reisende, kugelrunde Null, so a lovely and or irritating round as a ball zero. Not only does Jakob press his sort of masochistic willingness to be criticized, to revel in its pleasure, he often pushes the limits of the Institute's Vorschriften to elicit further delightful punishment. He is outwardly irritating. Jakob's first act every morning is to trigger this sort of Redegefecht between him and Kraus by lying in bed past the expected wake-up time. Jakob rationalizes the statement, saying, "Therefore I love deeply every kind of compulsion. This allows me to take joy in what is illicit." Jakob's illicitness, set here against institutional compulsion, the impatiently winning Kraus, gives Kraus center stage as a sort of representative of all the existing rules in the Institut Benjaminta. The neglected servant, uninstitutional imperative is turned into the spectacle of subjugation. Jakob takes great pleasure altercating with the raging Kraus. The institutional rage for Jakob bound within Kraus is alone seen as this rage of this Platonic indignant in the face of the sinner. In this battle of laziness and industriousness, Jakob recognizes the advantage of his detachment to institutional values. He says, those who passionately mean well, Kraus, are subject to those, me, to whose heart the good and conducive are not so important. Positioning himself as the rise and the foil, Jakob relishes in the divine form that Kraus takes. The sort of murmuring of the grumbler is lovelier to me than the murmuring of the woodland stream, the loveliest of Sunday morning sunshine sparkling upon it. Continuing this chain of thought, the still lounging Jakob reiterates imperatively the confronted Vorschrift to get up and sweep before the Benjamin's awakening. Jakob's pursuit is confoundingly paradoxical. He is dismissive of institutional discipline, but he's also obediently internalizing institutional rules without giving credence to either as a sort of essential attribute. The pursuit of the enigmatic positions Jakob both inside and outside the institution. As an imitator at best of his comrades, he may relish in their form receptively, he'll never take possession of this quality. And here we might gain more insight into this disruptiveness of his pursuit by bringing in Gilles Deleuze's character study of Bartleby the Scrivener, present in his essay Bartleby or the Formula. The disruption, hence the humor of Bartleby's I prefer not to or I would prefer not to, lies in its literalness. It is, according to Deleuze, grammatically correct, syntactically correct, but its abrupt termination, not to, which leaves what it rejects undetermined, converts upon it a character of a radical, a kind of limit function. Taken at face value by his boss, the attorney, it leaves the attorney in a stupor. Its portemonnaie construction of, I would prefer this, I would prefer not to do that, that is not what I prefer to do, is neither affirming or negating. It renders what he was doing, prefers to do, and is supposedly to prefer to continue doing impossible. Deleuze denotes this formula of pure patient passivity, this sort of foreign language within language, through which Bartleby stands as a pure outsider to whom no social position can be attributed. This outside position is like for Jakob, a structural position, beyond the secondary sensible nature governed by law. Bartleby's language stems from this terrible, supersensible primary nature, original and oceanic, which knowing no law pursues its own irrational aim through them. This aim being an anti-historical, anti-social, anti-institutional nothingness. And it is his primordial language that infests and works through Bartleby. Jakob's pursuits through the Deleuzian lens are likewise confirmed with this limit function. How can Jakob see to make meaning in a system that prescribes its own dissolution? The primordial language does not consume Jakob to the extent of Bartleby, who spews his outsideness. Rather, Jakob's disease is foremost presymptomatically located in his self-reflection, where primary and secondary nature combat. And reflecting on the repetitiveness of Fräulein Benjamin's discourse, Jakob states, "It is little, we are always repeating, but perhaps there's some mystery hidden behind all these nothings and laughable things." Laughable? We the boys of the Institut Benjamin never feel like laughing. Are we to perceive Jakob as engaging in mocking sincerity or this sort of naive mockery? Jakob in many ways operates dutifully towards the Institute. His ability to self-correct obfuscates the effects of the outside, and is only disclosed to the reader. Jakob, this figure of the primary nature, is an unwitting host of this primordial language. See the locus of disruption? We now must look at his interactions with the institution itself, constellation of pedagogy and discipline, embodied respectively by Fräulein and Herr Benjamin. Jakob matriculates as the runaway son of an aristocratic family, whose first interactions with the Benjamins present privilege as the root of his otherness. Jakob voices disdain for the Institute's lack of pedagogical approach and the sparse furnishings that are not subversive. To the Benjamin siblings, these are the complaints with determinate outcomes. Either Jakob will conform or he will rebel. Both Benjamins present hypotheses for understanding the dilemma of Jakob. Fräulein Benjamin, speaking to Jakob's treatment of Kraus, notes, "You quarrel with Kraus. Is this quarreling for you a sign of love or respect?" Jakob's conflict with the outside is brought from the realm of self-reflection into direct dialogue. Once again, we see Jakob's attempt to obfuscate its effects, saying, "Yes, to some extent, Fräulein. This quarreling isn't meant to be so seriously, you see. If Kraus were clever, he would notice that I like him better than any of the others. I respect Kraus very, very much. It would hurt me to think that you didn't believe that." Fräulein Benjamin mistakes this as a transparent statement of Jakob's devotion to Kraus. A good man, to which Jakob can only reply, yes, nothing more than yes. And then suddenly I had to laugh rather dumbly. I don't know why. The obfuscation of the outside masks as an act of obedience. Being elicited to rationalize his actions within the institutional logic, the language of the outside comes forth in this dummes Lachen, an unconscious, irrational reaction to the inability to voice the enigmatic. Herr Benjaminta picks up on Jakob's wish to become a servant, conflicting with the stagnancy of the institute. That is, this complaint is a question of inadequate schooling, of ignorance towards the institute's aims of self-nullification. In addressing this concern, Herr Benjaminta too seeks to gain insight into Jakob's self-reflection regarding this value, asking, Jakob, tell me, don't you find that your life here isn't a bit sparse? I would very much like to hear your opinion. Speak openly. Here too, obfuscation ultimately is unsuccessful. His attempts at silence and adopting the proper institutional response to such a question is still indeterminate. Jakob notes that his silence seems to say, Mein Herr, please allow me to be silent. To such a question that can say something very unbecoming. As Herr Benjaminta prods his interminate silence, he seeks to elicit a clarifying response. Jakob must be frech, cheeky, posing as a servant while internally mocking its values. If Jakob could only laugh, it would lend his character some determinacy. Yet to this, Jakob continues to remain silent. Deleuze, in speaking of Bartleby, notes a sort of pact made between him, made between Bartleby, the scrivener hired without any references, and the attorney who lacks reliable employees. Bartleby is to be the attorney's man. Tucked and seen within the attorney's office, he works industriously. Bartleby, though is exposed as the pure conduit of primordial language, being forced to correct the copies of the others, that is, he is quite literally exposed in the office. The pact between Jakob and his superordinates is similarly structured. So long as he must not speak to his actions, he can remain a sort of imitative servant. Jakob's contamination does not drive his subordinates away, but rather brings an effective element into their institutional values. Herr Benjaminta, begging for Jakob to speak, cuts himself off and makes a confession, saying, I've gained a curious, very peculiar, no longer to be controlled affinity for you. Fräulein Benjaminta too alters her perspective on the Kraus and Jakob relationship. Kraus is an institutional subject, is empty. He's not a person, but merely a Schaffer, an Ausüber, one who makes or who plies. It is Jakob who is the netter, the nicer. Though it's left ambiguous, this is a personal or a more sort of haptic quality. Jakob's aim for the enigmatic, adopted by Herr and Fräulein Benjaminta, becomes inverted into Jakob himself. They're unwilling to let him go. What Deleuze calls an unnatural alliance between them undermines and replaces the standard relations of the institution. Contrary to the institutional idea of unity through desubjectivity, the creation of the institutional subject, the enigmatic pursuit goes beyond similitude to the level of becoming. Just as Jakob rescinds self-nullification to imitate his schoolmates, Herr and Fräulein Benjaminta rescind their institutional roles to pursue Jakob. The latter two are driven to madness by their pursuits. Fräulein Benjaminta's unrequited declarations of affection for Jakob preface death of grief, and Herr Benjaminta stops accepting students until Jakob is the only one left. While this language of madness moves through Jakob, he, however, does not succumb to it. Jakob's obfuscation of this outside language cannot be understood as a duty to act under the aim of the outside. It is this indeterminative action present within and through Jakob as the pendulum between the primary nature and the logic of the secondary nature. Through Jakob, we may view his limit function formed around his laughter. While Jakob's self-reflections remain muzzled, Jakob's laughter escapes his mouth, but it's only a sort of emission of indeterminacy. And Charles Baudelaire writes in his essay on the essence of laughter, the laughter is only an expression, a symptom, a diagnostic. It is no longer a natural expression of contentment, for it's not object-oriented, according to Baudelaire, but a revelation of this essential contradiction within man, between his self-instilled superiority over other beings and the awareness of his mortal body. Thus, even in the innocent laughter of the child, one can envision the corrupted laughter of man. Jakob cannot define the source of his laughter. It remains for him a sort of purely self-referential object, something entzündendes, igniting like a match against wood, it being its pure opposite. Within the self-referentiality, we may understand the object of laughter and its origin to be united in its primary nature. Unconsciously, Jakob wants to suppress his laughter to a mere kichern or snicker. With the constellation of the institute reduced to just Jakob and Herr Benjaminta, It seems if Jakob could only freely laugh, we could experience a sort of union of primary nature, Jakob the outside, and the secondary nature, Benjamin to the institute. Yet this would be to fundamentally misunderstand this relationship. It is the suppression of laughter that contaminates. It threatens to reveal an absurdity without ever doing it, and thus hovers in the state of indeterminacy. So long as the institutional form exists, Jakob is bound to this indeterminate act. And so the story ends with Jakob and Benjamin departing together in the travel to the desert, a symbol of the indeterminacy paralleling their relationship. The humor of Jakob von Guten can, at one level, presented by Erika Weitzman in her essay The Playground of Literature, be read as an exemplary parody of Bildungsroman and its constellation of pedagogical demands and the ideology of free will. My reading this parodic interplay is the binding of primary and secondary nature, yet the laughter at the irony of this constellation, our laughter at the irony of this constellation is preempted by Jakob's. We're left to ask not at what he's laughing at, but in turn, what are we laughing at ourselves? Are we to place Jakob the outsider as a parody of the servile figure, autobiographically written from a cynical Walser? Or is Jakob more so seeking something more elusive, rationalization of something irrational, autobiographically written by Walser, the institutional self, seeking to giving these positions meaning? It is internally enclosed humor, and through it a failure to understand becomes humorous, becomes nonsensical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reid. We have one more presenter left, and then you're free to ask as many questions as you want. Of course. And our last presenter for the day and for this panel is Margaret Speer. Margaret is a fifth-year PhD student in the English department at the University of California, Irvine. Her dissertation is a transhistorical project in queer theory, though her focus is in the British long 19th century. Her talk today is titled, Are There No Men Present? Virginia Woolf's Performative Irony in a Room of One's Own. Please welcome Margaret Speer.
How's that? Is that okay? Okay, thanks. Thank you for having me. Thanks to everyone who had a hand in organizing this conference. And thanks especially to the staff people without whom we can't put on affairs like these. This talk is called Are There No Men Present? Virginia Woolf's Performative Irony in a Room of One's Own. The published text of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own is distilled from two talks she gave at Newnham College on October 10th, 1928, and then at Guten College 1 week later. The talks centered on the differences between men's and women's access to the requisite resources for achievement and contributions to culture. Jane Marcus calls Room a Marxist feminist theory of literary criticism. I suggest that Woolf makes the case that women's poverty is compulsory heterosexuality and shows that women's financial dependence cannot be extricated from women's sexuality. Using herself as an example, she suggests that financial independence freed her from compulsory heterosexuality. Quote, my aunt's legacy unveiled the sky to me and substituted for the large and imposing figure of a gentleman, which Milton recommended for my perpetual adoration, a view of the open sky, end quote. The freedom to think things in themselves that Woolf's narrator finds is sexualized as the greatest release of all. I want to offer this as a jumping off point to discuss the alternative that Woolf posits to women's poverty and compulsory heterosexuality. To my mind, Woolf's alternative is a particular register of female sociality, women's freedom to like one another, which requires women's freedom to inhabit rooms alone/together. Woolf elaborates this as an already existing fact of which all women know, but one which cannot be spoken in front of men. The portion of A Room of One's Own I want to read is that concerning Life's Adventure, a fabricated novel by the fabricated novelist Mary Carmichael, which contains the famous line, Chloe liked Olivia. This line is used by Lillian Faderman to title her anthology of lesbian literature from the 17th century to the present. Woolf arrives at this line from a longer meditation on writing by women, of which she writes there are, in her contemporary moment, quote, Poems and plays and criticism, there are histories and biographies, books of travel and books of scholarship and research. There are even a few philosophies and books about science and economics. And though novels predominate, novels themselves may very well have changed from association with books of a different feather. The natural simplicity, the epic age of women's writing may have gone. Reading and criticism may have given her a wider range, a greater subtlety. The impulse towards autobiography may be spent. She may be beginning to use writing as an art, not as a method of self-expression. Among these new novels, one might find an answer to several questions." End of quote. Woolf is here saying that women's writing has become theoretical. Not only are women writing directly about practical and theoretical questions, philosophy and criticism, even women's novels can newly answer questions. This rhetorical gesture is a means for Woolf implicitly to claim that she herself is making theory right here, right now. I will return in a moment to the theoretical position Woolf takes. For now, I want to concentrate on the example of Carmichael's novel. Narrating having taken it down from the shelf as an example of women's new kind of writing, Woolf says, and this is another long quote, "I turned the page and read, 'I am sorry to break off so abruptly. Are there no men present? Do you promise me that behind that red curtain over there, the figure of Sir Charles Biron is not concealed? We are all women, you assure me? Then I may tell you that the very next words I read were these, Chloe liked Olivia." End quote. Liking is not a scandalous affect for women to share. For Chloe to like Olivia ought not disturb anyone's feelings or disrupt the working of society. However, by the time Woolf announces this liking as a fact, she has already given it a more significant charge by her reference to Sir Charles Biron. Biron, the magistrate who presided over the obscenity trial of the Well of Loneliness, functions here as a semi-ridiculous stand-in for male paranoia. Ridiculous or no, Woolf's tongue-in-cheek invocation necessarily refers her audience to sexuality between women. But at the same time, by insisting that she cannot go on until she is assured that no men are present, Woolf also suggests that men, or heteropatriarchal governance, prohibits women simply liking each other, sharing a laboratory, working together, as Chloe and Olivia do. Woolf then strategically conflates what may well be chaste female friendship with an illicit but empirically absent lesbian sexuality in the next 4 sentences. Another quote. "Do not start, do not blush. Let us admit in the privacy of our own society that these things sometimes happen. Sometimes women do like women. Chloe liked Olivia, perhaps for the first time in literature. Cleopatra did not like Octavia, and how completely Antony and Cleopatra would have been altered had she done so. As it is, I thought, letting my mind, I am afraid, wander a little from life's adventure, the whole thing is simplified, conventionalized, if one dared say it, absurdly. Cleopatra's only feeling about Octavia is one of jealousy. Is she taller than I am? How does she do her hair? The play perhaps required no more, but how interesting it would have been if the relationship between the two women had been more complicated. All these relationships between women, I thought, rapidly recalling the splendid gallery of fictitious women, are too simple. So much has been left out, unattempted, and I tried to remember any case in the course of my reading where two women are represented as friends. There is an attempt of it in Diana of the Crossways. They are confidants, of course, in Racine and the Greek tragedies. They are now and again mothers and daughters, but almost without exception they are shown in their relation to men. It was strange to think that all of the great women of fiction were, until Jane Austen's day, not only seen by the other sex, but seen only in relation to the other sex. And how small a part of a woman's life is that, and how little can a man know even of that when he observes it through the black or rosy spectacles which sex puts upon his nose." End quote. This moment in the text is highly performative. Some scholars miss its irony, citing examples which precede Woolf's fictionalized one. But Woolf is here making much of the novelty of the historical moment, not as one in which the invert can newly walk free, but when women can be thought of for themselves, by themselves. These converge with her play on the idea that men worry about women's secret lesbianism when they are left in rooms alone together. She laughs at this fear while simultaneously performing the threat. Only if there are no men present does it become possible to say that two women like each other, to admit the secret amongst ourselves. And yet there remains something so banal and quotidian about Chloe's liking Olivia that the idea of Biron crouching behind a curtain in order to catch women out in their secrets becomes comedy at his expense. Woolf is only half joking, however. The other half is a serious postulate that lesbian sexuality is simply women being alone together, and, as if to confirm the worst fears of men like Biron, it happens all the time. Woolf constructs a theory of women's homo-relationality by describing non-sexual relationships between women colored by the brush of lesbianism only insofar as such relationships cannot be spoken of in front of men. The register of relationality for which Chloe liked Olivia is metonymic is varied and rich. It is women's whole lives as opposed to the small part viewed through the rosy or black spectacles sex puts upon man's nose. Like Adrienne Rich's lesbian continuum, this register of relationality includes eroticism, motherhood, daughterhood, friendship. Though sexuality between women is half-jokingly included, what Woolf is getting at can absolutely not be reduced to sex. Sharon Marx's critique of Lillian Faderman's insistence on the eroticism of Chloe plus Olivia is correct. One would be hard-pressed to prove it. Nonetheless, the homo-relational mode of liking is a secret that women know instinctively to hide from men. In what follows, Woolf rhetorically overplays the secret to show both the ridiculousness but also the requirement of its concealment. Quote, "For if Chloe likes Olivia and Mary Carmichael knows how to express it, she will light a torch in that vast chamber where nobody has been yet. It is all half-lights and profound shadows, like those serpentine caves where one goes with a candle, peering up and down, not knowing where one is stepping. I wanted to see how Mary Carmichael set to work to catch those unrecorded gestures, those unsaid or half-said words which form themselves no more palpably than the shadows of moths on the ceiling when women are alone, unlit by the capricious and colored light of the other sex. She will need to hold her breath," I said, reading on, "if she is to do it, for women are so suspicious of any interest that has not some obvious motive behind it, so terribly accustomed to concealment and suppression, that they are off at the flicker of an eye turned observingly in their direction." End quote. This passage illustrates above all the secrecy of this mode of relations, the arcane theory of relationality when women are alone, illustrated by turns of phrase like half-lights and profound shadows, unsaid or half-said words, is ironically enough initiated by Biron's own attempt to suppress representations of lesbianism. His name is enough to evoke both the taboo and the predictable failure of heteropatriarchal impulses to regulate women's relations. What follows from Woolf's jibe about men's fear of what women do when they are alone together is an assertion in no uncertain terms that men cannot share, let alone legislate, what women know of themselves and each other, nor what they do by themselves and with each other. I have suggested that Woolf asserts women are becoming theoretical in their writing, and that Woolf herself is writing theory in a room of one's own. Her theoretical position is productive to think vis-a-vis a debate in queer theory about whether it is same-sex sexuality or friendship which disturbs heterosexual patriarchy the most. Michel Foucault asserts in the interview Friendship as a Way of Life that the development toward which the problem of homosexuality tends is one of friendship. He insists that it is men's homosexual mode of life, friendship, fidelity, and camaraderie, much more so than the sexual act itself, which unsettles the dominant order. His examples are all taken from masculine forms of social bonding. Quote, "How is it possible for men to be together, to live together, to share their time, their meals, their rooms, their leisure, their grief, their knowledge, their confidences?" End quote. On the other hand, Leo Bersani's landmark essays, The Rectum a Grave, claims that the most radical aspect of homosexuality is the moment of bottoming among men. Though he does not address women's sexuality, Bersani undergirds his assertion that it is the sexual feminization of men which most disrupts heterosexual patriarchy by a particular understanding of female sexuality. Arriving at the notion that being penetrated is irreducibly a submission to violence through women, Bersani claims that Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon were correct. Heterosexual sex is violence against women. At best, then, women are a conduit for thinking about men. Both sides totally ignore women on their own terms. Woolf's intervention, as it were, is to show the falseness of this bifurcation when the question is applied to women. In Woolf's thinking about women, it becomes clear that the opposition between cottaging, having sex in public places, and shacking up is a false one. The drama of Woolf's announcement that Chloe likes Olivia points up the fact that women's bonds are underconsidered, then as now, and provides a feminist counterpoint. Woolf's liking seems to partake of the Foucauldian register of affection, tenderness, friendship, fidelity, camaraderie, and companionship. At the same time, the force of the scandal, as Sharon Marcus aptly calls it, comes from the very real need for secrecy when men suspect women of sexuality together, which Woolf suggests is any time women are alone together. Put another way, that Woolf stops and says she cannot go on to say that Chloe likes Olivia unless they are all women for fear of Biron, makes it so much more powerful that Chloe and Olivia don't explicitly have sex. Lesbian feminist scholars and queer theorists who are concerned with women have made much of a drafted palimpsest of the Biron passage, in which Chloe and Olivia momentarily might share more than a laboratory. Jane Marcus was the first to examine an earlier draft of the talk, in which Woolf writes that the pages had stuck together right after Chloe and Olivia shared a ... A flood of images of officials and book burnings enters the reader/writer's mind. Upon unsticking the pages, she breathes a sigh of relief. Quote, "Heaven be praised, it was only a laboratory." Madeline Detloff offers the best reading of this passage, linking the, quote, "implied solipsis shifting from an erotic innuendo to a relatively staid workplace to Woolf's argument in 3 Guineas, that the economic freedom for male relatives made more possible by the 1919 Sex Disqualification Removal Act enabled women who earned their own livings to make decisions without prostituting themselves to male desires, whether sexual or social. The educated man's daughter, Woolf writes, need no longer use her charm to procure money from her father or brother. Since it is beyond the power of her family to punish her financially, she can express her own opinions. In place of the admirations and antipathies which were often unconsciously dictated by the need of money, she can declare her genuine likes and dislikes." End of quote. Detloff here implicitly concurs that women's poverty is compulsory heterosexuality. I want to take her reading one step further and stay with a room of one's own, where it is already apparent that women's inhabitation of rooms alone together, which requires financial independence for men, is the requisite condition for women's liking one another, whatsoever that means. Readings like Hermione Lee, Lauren Rusk, Gay Watchman, and Ellen Bayuk-Rosamond's, by contrast, strip both the passage and Woolf's gesture of revision of their richness, understanding the former as a straightforward admission of lesbian sexuality and the latter as simple self-censorship. Rosamond writes, quote, "Society might be ready to read and reward women writers, but lesbianism remained almost literally unspeakable." Adam Parks appropriates for the excision Vita Sackville-West's explanation of Virginia Woolf's illness after a 1929 trip to Berlin, quote, "suppressed randiness." He also compares, as I will, Virginia Woolf and Radcliffe Hall, citing as crucial difference between Woolf and Hall this certain reticence. I hope it is already clear from my argument that we ought to read this moment as strategy more than sexual shyness or suppressed randiness. I propose that the earlier draft is in fact no more sexually explicit than the one we actually receive, seeing as Chloe and Olivia indeed share only a laboratory. The register of reference to female sexuality is the same as in the final version. Both are tongue-in-cheek nods to the intrusion of paranoid male assumptions about what it turns out Chloe and Olivia explicitly don't share. While we are free to imagine that Chloe and Olivia really share more, and what would be materially different if they did, might it be productive to take their non-sexual bond at face value? For me, the crucial fact is that Chloe and Olivia are friends who share a laboratory, and Biron is still a menacing presence. What this shows is that women alone together, women merely liking each other, registers as sex to a censorious heterosexual patriarchal gaze. The trick Woolf plays on this gaze is to use it to sexualize female bonds where they would otherwise not be sexual. Since the specter of sexuality between women would not appear at all without Woolf's reference to Biron, it is men's very paranoia about female sexuality that sexualizes women together. The ultimate irony is that women having sex with each other, as in the Well of Loneliness, is made to converge with women's liking each other and working together under Biron's sign of the patriarchy. The masculinist prohibition on women simply liking each other renders women's sexuality and sociality inextricable. Woolf both satirizes and makes the most of this conflation to theorize a mode of relationality unconducive to legislative regulation. If Biron were aghast that Chloe liked Olivia, what could be done about it? Liking evades sodomitical definition and is hardly gross indecency, unlike the inversion model which rendered the Well of Loneliness so vulnerable to censorship. While the inversion model privileges sexual difference and thus sex, The version of sex that Biran, crouched behind the curtain, thinks he can catch women out in will never occur in this particular room where Woolf is speaking. Liking means that while of course there can be sex without sexual difference, is hardly the point. The point to win is the room in which it might or might not happen. The availability of the homo-relationality Woolf theorizes to legislative regulation was tested in Scotland in 1810. Jane Prairie and Marianne Woods, two school teachers, also friends who worked together, were accused of lesbianism by a student. Their trial centered around libel because there was no legal language for the thing of which they had been accused. Lord Gillies, presiding over the Woods Prairie trial, said, quote, "Are we to say that every woman who has formed an early intimacy and has slept in the same bed with another is guilty? Where is the innocent woman in Scotland?" Beneath the hyperbole is the real anxiety, the same one that Woolf performatively mocks and confirms when she suggests that one definition of lesbianism is women's unsupervised proximity to one another, which, to occur, requires rooms of our own. Thank you.